Welcome, dear horror writer, to Camp Horror Scriptorium. I'm your head counselor, Victoria, and I'll be guiding you through the world of slasher storytelling this week. Before we dive in, there's a few rules that you need to know. Rule 1, stay together and don't wander off alone. Rule 2, keep your flashlight handy because the electricity likes to stop working at night, and same goes for cell towers, but that's not important because we already confiscated your phones. And rule 3, absolutely no going out at night. Trust me, you don't want to get hacked to bits by some deranged psychopath lurking in the dark. And if by some awful chance that you do find yourself face to face with him, don't run. Running makes it just worse for you. Ask the last two counselors. So needless to say, it's better just to accept the fact that you are going to die. But hey, that's the price of a good story, right? Anywho, I hope you have a great week here at Camp Horror Scriptorium. Stick close, keep your wits and pencils sharp, and get ready to write some nightmares that will haunt your readers long after the campfire burns out. This is slasher horror. So what is slasher horror? At its core, slasher horror is a horror subgenre that is defined by a killer stalking and murdering a group of people, usually with a bladed weapon, one by one. But to leave it at that would be oversimplifying what has become one of horror's most recognizable and enduring forms of fear. Slasher films mark a significant shift from earlier horror that focused more on monsters, ghosts, or religious dread. Instead of supernatural forces, slashers brought terror into the real world, usually through a single, very human killer. And these killers aren't hidden in shadows of their castles or explained away with folklore, but they're up front and center and are deeply broken, sometimes silent, and almost always relentless. Now, here's a little history lesson for you. The earliest blueprint for what would become the slasher genre can be traced back to Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho in 1960. With Norman Bates, audiences were introduced to a character who wasn't only the killer, but also the psychological center of the story. Psycho emphasized suspense and personal trauma, and it introduced something new to the horror landscape, which was a murderer who was disturbingly human, complex, and close to home. The film pushed boundaries in terms of on-screen violence and its portrayal of mental illness. As for its setting, which was the Bates Motel, it's become more than just a location, but the Bates Motel was an extension of Norman himself, which foreshadowed how future slashers would use setting to enhance characters and theme. Around the same time, Peeping Tom was exploring similar territory in Britain, which was pushing voyeurism and psychological obsession to their limits. Then, in 1974, Black Christmas laid more groundwork for its unseen killer, disturbing phone calls, and holiday setting, all of which would become staples of the genre. But it wasn't until 1978 that slasher horror exploded into full view with John Carpenter's Halloween. Halloween refined the slasher formula, and it introduced a highly structured plot rhythm, which is a slow build of daytime tension, repeated glimpses of the killer in the background, and then a final frenzied eruption of violence. It gave us Michael Myers, a figure of pure shape and silence, whose presence didn't need explanation. He just was. This helped establish the idea of the killer as a force that's usually unkillable, emotionless, and unstoppable. And probably most importantly, Halloween was the first film to make a major sequel part of the slasher DNA, which gave us the concept of a killer returning again and again and again and again. And I'm looking at you, Jason. And with Halloween, this kicked off the golden age of slashers. The 1980s followed a tidal wave of slasher flicks, including Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, Sleepaway Camp, and many, many more, which launched iconic killers into pop culture. And slashers during this period weren't just about trying to scare the audience, but they became about creating a spectacle. The kills got bloodier, the weapons became more creative, and the victims more varied. And underneath all the blood and screaming, early slashers usually carried a moral message, and the idea of punishment was woven into the kills. Characters who drank, did drugs, or had sex were usually the ones to die first. While this moral lens feels incredibly outdated now, but it speaks to how slashers mirrored societal fears at the time, especially around youth and rebellion. Whether intentional or not, the killer became a punishing force for moral transgression. All in all, the slasher subgenre gave horror something it hadn't really had before: villains who were human yet mythic, and killers who could be hurt but never truly stopped, violence that didn't just haunt you but chased you. Just like the genre of horror itself, slasher killers come in all different shapes and sizes. And while, yes, it is true that the slasher villain's job is to take out the characters in your story, but it's also their job to haunt. They linger in the corners of the page long after the chapter ends. They're felt in the silence and the flicker of a light and the slow turning of a doorknob. They're part monster, part metaphor, and always purposeful. And if you're writing horror, especially slashers, your killer is a threat, but they're also gravity pulling the story into orbit. Their design, their silence, their symbolism, even their footsteps. All of these details matter. So here's a breakdown of the 5 most popular types of slasher killers. First, we have the brute. These killers are immovable. They don't run, they don't yell, but they advance slowly, steadily, and without pause. Think of Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees, or Victor Crowley. Brutes are death itself given human shape, and there's no negotiation or emotion, just inevitability. They're relentless, unstoppable, and unshaken. To write the brute effectively, you want to focus on how the world responds to them, not the other way around. The brute doesn't need to speak or move quickly to be terrifying because their stillness is what creates dread. So frame them in silence. Let their presence suck the air out of the room by killing conversations and freezing characters in their tracks. Essentially, they become the center of gravity and everything else spirals in panic around them. To keep the brute interesting, you want to rely on visual storytelling. Show their indifference to pain, their disregard for barriers, and how nothing stops them from their pursuit. Locks break, walls fall, weapons fail. Let the reader feel how the world shrinks the moment the brute appears, and how escape becomes less about running and more about surviving long enough to be caught. Next, we have the performer. This type of killer thrives on spectacle, hence why they're called the performer. For them, murder is an art form. Think of Freddy Krueger or Art the Clown. Both are great examples because they're theatrical, expressive, and terrifying because you never quite know what they're going to do next. And performers don't just stalk their victims, but they taunt, tease, and turn every kill into a stage production. Freddy delivers one-liners while Art doesn't speak at all, yet he says everything through exaggerated, twisted pantomime. Whether verbal or silent, performers demand your attention and make sure you suffer as you give it. To write a performer effectively, you want to treat their dialogue like a weapon. Every word they say should sting, confuse, or manipulate. And if they don't speak, let their body do the talking. Their movements should be deliberate, almost like they're being choreographed. Describe how they tilt their head, how they walk towards the victim, how they pause before the final sickening blow. Focus on their flair and ask yourself, what do they do before a kill? Do they have rituals, strange tics, or personal rules they follow? One important thing to remember is don't turn them into comedians unless you're writing a horror comedy. Their humor should always unsettle us because they're not cracking jokes to entertain us, but instead they're legitimately having fun, and that's the most disturbing part of it. Now we have the Avenger. These killers are driven by pain and are people who have been wronged, ignored, humiliated, or destroyed, sometimes by a single person or sometimes by an entire system. And now they've come back to settle the score with these people. Films like Valentine and The Burning all center around killers shaped by personal trauma, turning their suffering into a trial of blood. To write the Avenger effectively, let their story bleed into the victims. Each death might mirror a memory, a grievance, or a specific moment from the past that broke them. Every kill can act as a message, but don't reveal everything at once. Let their backstory unfold through subtle clues like a yearbook photo tucked in a drawer, a witness who remembers a forgotten name, or a phone number that's been carved into a desk that leads to something much more darker. Now, the Avenger is most effective when your audience isn't sure if they're watching a monster or someone the world turned into a monster. Their motives shouldn't overshadow the horror, but it should fuel it, making every scream echo with something far more deeper than fear. Now let's talk about the mythic figure. These are killers that are feared but also believed in. They're the stuff of local legends and warnings, the kind of presence that lingers in alleyways, old houses, and childhood memories. They might be ghosts or something more layered, like a being that's part curse, part folklore, and part demon, or even all three if you want. Candyman is a perfect example of a mythic figure. Now, to write the mythic figure effectively, think of them as an urban legend that's been brought to to life. And to do that, you need origin stories and warnings. Also, give them graffiti scrawled on bathroom walls, eerie nursery rhymes sung on campgrounds, and campfire stories passed down through generations. These are your narrative tools to build atmosphere and dread before the character even appears on the page. And while, yes, the mythic slasher is a murderer, but they're also a symbol. The horror is generational, tied to deeper themes like gentrification, racial violence, or forgotten history. These slashers should feel like a reckoning instead of a random act of bloodshed. Their story is never just about killing, it's about what the world tried to bury and then it came back. And lastly, we have the satirist or the deconstructionist. This type of killer doesn't just follow the rules of the genre, but they toy with them. Think of Leslie Vernon from Behind the Mask. Yes, he's a murderer, but he's also a horror fan. One unique thing about these characters is that they often break the fourth wall, parodying classic tropes or twist the structure of a traditional slasher to keep both the characters and the audience off balance. And to write them well, you need to know your horror inside out, then subvert it. If your killer is meta-aware, use that to make them unpredictable. Maybe they talk openly about the final girl trope and then kill her off halfway through the story. Or maybe they stage their kills with theatrical precision, all the while explaining their methods like a twisted professor. The key is to keep them one step ahead, always aware and always in control. But here's the thing, satirical slashers can't survive on cleverness alone. The horror still has to feel real. You can bend the structure, poke fun at cliches, and add a wink to the readers, but their fear underneath must remain sincere. Without that, the whole thing risks turning into a gimmick instead of a genuine nightmare. Once you've figured out the kind of killer that you want to unleash into your story, now it's time to give them an identity, and that means crafting a signature look, a distinct presence, and giving them a ritual. Your killer is so much more than just a maniac with a knife. They're a myth in the making, and every choice you make, from their mask to their weapon to the way they move through a scene, all tells the audience who they are at their core, even before they speak a word. Or don't. The best way to think about it is that your slasher killer is psychology in motion. So let's start with the mask. A mask isn't just for hiding their face, but it becomes their face and it carries meaning, history, and fear. Think about Michael Myers. His mask is pale and blank, a visual embodiment of emotional vacancy, or William Shatner. Or look at Ghostface, whose mask is all exaggerated plastic, stretched into a permanent scream, mocking both his victims and the idea of fear itself. So a good place to start with this is to ask, what is your killer's mask trying to say? Was it made or found? And was it chosen carefully with intention? Or was it the only thing left at the Halloween store and it had to suffice because they were desperate? Also, a killer who wears a vintage gas mask is very different from one who's in a stitched rabbit face. So you want to think of the mask's texture, because the wear and grime of the mask tells a story. A mask should reflect how your killer sees the world and how they want the world to see them. And when done right, the mask becomes inseparable from the myth. Now we have the weapon. This is where the killer's mind meets their method. A knife may be simple, but it's also intimate. A pickaxe, like in My Bloody Valentine, speaks to a life buried in labor and resentment. The fishing hook in I Know What You Did Last Summer connects directly to guilt and consequence dragged up from the past. So think about what your killer's weapon says about them. Is it something from their childhood, a tool tied to their trauma, or an object they've repurposed into a ritualistic instrument? A killer who uses piano wire tells a very different story from one who favors bolt cutters. So let the weapon feel personal, not just something they picked up, but something they chose. Your readers should remember whatever it is instantly and associate it with a specific emotion like dread, disgust, fascination, etc. And finally, we have the signature. The signature is something that your killer always does, and it's the act that turns murder into a ritual. It might be theatrical, like Freddy Krueger's taunts, or silent and eerie, like Art the Clown miming his intentions. Yes, I'm picking on them today. Some killers film their crimes, whisper to the dead victim, or leave something behind. Think of these patterns as rhythms in the killer's madness. Maybe your killer always places a mirror in front of their victims, or maybe they braid their hair hair after each kill. These details make them feel real, and they create unease because they hint at obsession, compulsion, or to something that's deeply broken inside of them. And a good signature stays in the background until the reader starts to notice it, and by then, it's already burned into their memory. So when the mask, the weapon, and the ritual all work together, what you get is the killer, but also a presence, a legend, and a figure who can walk into the dark and be recognized by your characters by silhouette alone. And that's when you know your slasher has come alive on the page. Now let's dive into the slasher's backstory, because understanding where they came from is important, but don't worry, that doesn't mean that you have to write a full biography on them that details their life from birth to the moment that they appear in your story, but you do need to know why they exist in the first place. So you want to ask, what do they represent within the world you've created? Are they a symbol of something your protagonist is trying to repress, a manifestation of guilt, shame, or rage, or a dark secret the town's trying to bury? This deeper meaning is the emotional core you want to build around, and once you've identified that, their history begins to take shape. You can then start asking questions like, what moment twisted them into what they are now? What kind of pain, belief, or obsession drives them? And what keeps them going once the blood starts to spill? Next, when it comes to revealing their past, you want to do it again slowly, piece by piece, through environment and characters they haunt. Use tools that feel natural in the world of your story, like a cryptid police report tucked into a drawer, a shaky campfire retelling from a survivor who only half believes their own memory. Maybe it's the killer's bedroom, frozen in time, covered in obsessive journal entries and crude artwork that tells us that they had a long, painful spiral into madness. These details work better than direct exposition because they feel earned, and they let your reader engage with the mystery. Think of Friday the 13th and how the legend of Jason doesn't just get given to us right away. Instead, there's talk of a boy who drowned, a mother who snapped, and a camp cursed by tragedy. But the film never lays it out in one sole monologue. They release it through atmosphere, myth, and memory, and that's what makes it unsettling, because this way, the mystery feels real. A great slasher's backstory doesn't just explain who they are, it deepens the horror by revealing why this story needed them in the first place. In slasher horror and almost every other genre, the main character is the one who anchors the chaos. They're the emotional through line that takes the readers from the first scene to the last breath. And the main character doesn't have to be a hero or even survive, but they do have to feel real. Whether they're running from the killer, fighting back, or unraveling the mystery behind it all, their voice is the one your audience follows into the dark. Now, with slashers, there's a long tradition of the main character being the final girl, and there's a reason it's stuck. Characters like Laurie Strode in Halloween or Ginny in Friday the 13th Part 2 connected with viewers because they felt like people. They, by all means, weren't superheroes, but rather they were awkward, anxious, clever, and afraid. They made mistakes. They reacted well to some situations, while other times they didn't. But by their characters being written like this, they gave the horror weight. But that doesn't mean that your main character has to be a final girl. They can be any gender and identify as whatever you want. The key here is writing them as a person first, not a trope. So you want to think about who your character was before the blood started flowing. What were they struggling with? What do they care about? What are they trying to prove or escape from? Maybe they're angry, maybe they're numb, maybe they're carrying a secret no one else knows. The horror works best when it crashes into an already complicated life. And when the killer decides to arrive, it shouldn't feel like the beginning of the story. It should feel like an interruption, something worse showing up in the middle of something already hard. One way to raise the stakes is to give your main character some kind of connection to the killer. Maybe they share a history, maybe they're related, or maybe the killer is hunting them for a specific reason that's tied to a shared past, a mistake, or a buried memory. In A Nightmare on Elm Street, Nancy is trying to survive Freddy Krueger while also being caught in the consequences of what the parents in their town did years before. That kind of link can give your story depth and tragedy and make the violence personal and the fear more intimate. Now, your protagonist doesn't need to be the strongest or smartest person in the story. They just need to be active. They should make choices, even bad ones. Let them panic, let them freeze, let them lash out, and then let them grow from it. Some of the most compelling slasher characters aren't brave from the start, but they find courage when they have nothing left. Another key piece is their relationships. Your main character, just like you and me, have a life. And some of those people in their life are with them during the carnage of your story. So you want to show how they interact with the group, with their best friend, with their crush, with the one they can't stand. Because by doing so, you can define how we feel about those characters. And those connections also raise the stakes when people start dying. It's one thing to watch strangers getting killed, but it's something entirely different when your protagonist is forced to see people they care about die or hate one by one. Now, slashers are quick and you don't have a lot of time, so you want to write purposefully. Every line of dialogue and every gesture should tell us something about who this person is. Instead of giving them long monologues, use small, specific moments like a look, a hesitation, a reaction to the scream. That's how we learn who someone is under pressure. And to make your main character stand out, give them something unexpected. Maybe they're into taxidermy, which could come in handy later on. Maybe they're an obsessive journal keeper and that's how they figure out who the slasher is. Maybe they were supposed to leave town that night but didn't. Using unique traits like this make them stick in the reader's mind and open doors for fresh conflict. At the end of the day, the best slasher protagonists feel like real people. They're flawed, they're reactive, they're human, and sometimes they live, sometimes they don't. But their presence gives the story shape and soul. So build them like you're telling a ghost story around a fire and make sure we care about what happens to them when the woods go quiet. While some slashers might come off as a string of deaths stitched together for shock value, it's not. A good slasher is about pacing fear, building tension, and creating violent moments that feel earned rather than thrown in. A way that I like to think about it is that a well-written kill scene is a miniature horror story. It begins with an unease, builds with misdirection, and ends with an explosion of violence that leaves a mark on the reader. And not just because of the brutal death that just happened, but because of how it unfolded. Now, suspense always outshines gore unless you're writing spotter horror. And why suspense outshines gore is because if you rush the kill, you lose the dread. So the key is to linger in the before. Let the character hear something in the walls. Let them look under the bed twice and still miss what's there. Let them think they've escaped only to realize when it's too late that they were actually being herded to where the killer wanted them to be. What you're trying to do here is to get the reader's heartbeat to climb before the blood ever spills. And to do so, you're going to slow things down by immersing your reader into what the character is feeling. And you're going to do that by focusing on sensory detail, like what do they smell in the air? What sound breaks the silence as they're hiding in the closet? What physical sensation gives them away, like sweat on the back of their neck, a sudden draft, or the feeling of being watched? Now, every slasher kill works best when it follows a rhythm, which is setup, misdirection, and payoff. The setup is the moment of vulnerability your character finds themselves in. Maybe they're in the shower, maybe they've been separated from the group, maybe they just made a terrible and irreversible choice that they haven't realized yet. Next is misdirection, and this is the red herring where you show danger in one direction while hiding it in another. And lastly is the payoff, and when it finally comes, it needs to hit hard. It might be fast and brutal or drawn out and agonizing, but it has to deliver the promise of dread you've been building up. Now, while a knife is the traditional weapon choice of slasher killers, don't make it your default just because it's tradition. You want to treat each kill as a chance to innovate. Use a setting, irony, and personal objects. A killer who uses tools from a workshop, a musical instrument, or even kitchen utensils, that's not a knife, will feel more grounded and unpredictable. Think about how Jason turned a sleeping bag into a murder weapon, or how in Scream, Ghostface turned a garage door into a death trap. And it's these kill scenes that stick with the viewer or reader because they surprised us. A tip here, and something that I like to do myself, is to pretend that you're a director and block out the action. Visualize it, walk the space in your head. Where's the killer hiding? Where does the character run? Where does it all end? You want to describe the movement in a way that creates disorientation and panic, but don't make it so disorientating that you sacrifice clarity. A reader should be able to see the kill as it happens, and that means using strong active verbs and avoiding passive descriptions. For example, he wasn't attacked by something in the shadows. Instead, something tore into him from behind and drove him to the floor. You want to let the violence be visceral and grounded. And sometimes the most haunting kills are the ones that we don't see. An off-screen or off-page death lets you lean into implication. Let the reader hear the scream through the door and show the aftermath instead, like the bloodied sheets, the knocked over lamp, the body strung up on a hook like a rag doll in the basement. The key here is to use restraint when it serves the story, especially if you want a death to feel sudden, shocking, or psychologically disturbing. It's not always about splatter, sometimes it's about silence. Also, a good kill can carry meaning. It might reveal something about the killer's personality or moral code. It might echo a character's past mistake. It might be poetic justice or a cruel punchline to an earlier joke. Think about the emotional shape of each death. Is it terrifying? Is it tragic? Is it so absurd it loops back around to being horrifying? The more layered to the moment, the more it will stick. Now, lastly, and most importantly, don't let your kills feel interchangeable. If the reader couldn't describe the difference between death number 3 and death number 5, then you're not distinct enough. Each kill should stand on its own and be tied to the victim's personality, the setting, or the killer's style. So whether you're writing a slasher for a short story or a full novel, make each death a turning point in tone, pacing, or plot. And remember, a slasher isn't about stacking bodies, it's about making sure each body tells a story the reader won't forget. A running theme that you find a lot in horror, and this also applies to slashers, is that the setting is never just the landscape to your story, but it becomes a breathing, living part of the story. The killer navigates it like a predator in a cage, slipping through hallways, emerging from shadows, crashing through windows without warning. The setting isn't just simply hosting the violence, but it's enhancing it, shaping it, and containing it like a trapdoor snapping shut. A good slasher setting should feel claustrophobic even when it's open. And this is your paradox. The woods are vast, but the victims always get lost. A school should be safe, but when the power goes out over winter break, it becomes a tomb. Familiarity is the bait, and the more ordinary the world seems, the more disturbing it is when that safety is violated. This is why films like Halloween still work so well, because the quiet suburban street doesn't look like a place where evil should exist. And that's exactly why it does. Now, as a writer, you want to think of your setting as a self-contained game board. Once your characters enter the game, all their exits vanish. Every hallway, stairwell, basement door, attic ladder, all have to serve a narrative function. There should be nowhere to run that doesn't come with a risk. A kitchen isn't just a place to talk over drinks, but it's where every knife might have vanished. A garage isn't just cluttered with tools, but it's where the engine won't turn over and the killer is already behind them. I know that's cringe cliche, but essentially, what you're doing here is letting the environment become the antagonist. Tight spaces amplify fear, like broken lights create shadows the killer can use. An unplugged phone or dead cell signal is all it takes to shift from tension to helplessness. So don't waste your setting, use it like a weapon. Now let's move over to atmosphere. Atmosphere is about what your characters see, but also about what your readers hear, smell, and feel. So describe the buzz of a flickering fluorescent bulb. Let the silence stretch after a scream. Mention the faint creak of a floorboard when no one should be upstairs. The best way to think about this is that language becomes your sound design. For example, in The Strangers, one of the creepiest moments happens in complete silence. The killer appears in the background and just watches. And you can do this in prose by controlling what the reader sees. Let them glimpse something the character misses, linger on the stillness, and the dread grows before anything happens. Writing visual horror on the page is about restraint and timing, so don't show the blade too soon. Instead, focus on the hand reaching for the doorknob, the flicker of movement in the dark mirror, the looming shape growing taller behind the curtain. Also, you want to describe the rhythm of movement through space. Use verbs that feel physical and make the architecture feel alive and hostile, because a well-written setting should tighten its grip around the story. Now, as for structure, a slasher usually follows the three-act structure, which is the setup, the confrontation, and the resolution. But it's within that familiar rhythm that lies the key to controlling fear. And knowing when to build pressure and when to release it is what makes a slasher pulse with suspense. So the setup is where we have the introduction to the story and where we establish the cast, and also where something wrong begins to hum beneath the surface. Our group of characters may seem carefree, but trauma may simmer just below the jokes. Unspoken tensions may linger in conversations, or maybe a past mistake is hiding in plain sight, ready to reveal itself. This is also where we get the first death, and the first death should be shocking, but it should also break the illusion that everyone is safe. And once that line is crossed, the game changes. In the confrontation phase, this is where fear takes over. The killer grows closer, both physically and emotionally. Panic starts to override logic, and trust between the characters erodes. Here, pacing becomes your sharpest tool, which means that you don't want to let the murders fall into a predictable rhythm, but instead what you want to do is create an unexpected burst of violence. For example, kill off two characters back to back, then slow it down. Let the silence creep in. Give your readers time to worry about what's going to come next, and then hit them again. Also, you want to use misdirection with narrative devices like red herrings, false alarms, and suspenseful moments. And even though these all lead to nothing plot-wise, they can all still serve a purpose because they make the terror hit harder. Readers shouldn't just be wondering who dies, but should be wondering when and how and whether they'll even see it coming. Next, we have the climax, which is the emotional and psychological peak. Whoever manages to survive the carnage, which in slashers, like I said before, is typically the final girl, will find that they've been changed by what they have just gone through. And the confrontation must carry that weight. If your killer represents repression, shame, or trauma, then defeating them isn't just about survival, but also one of transformation. Because a good climax answers questions while raising new ones. Maybe the killer is finally unmasked, revealing their identity, or maybe there's a second twist. In a story like Scream, the structure is so finely tuned that even as it subverts the genre's expectations, it never loses clarity. What you can do is think of your story like a haunted house. Each scene is a different room, and you decide where the scares happen. You decide how long the tension stretches before it snaps. Let the pacing guide the reader through the fear, release, surprise, and dread of each room, and let the story breathe, but never let it relax. Well, it looks like you survived a week here at Camp Horror Scriptorium and never ran into Herman. So congratulations on that, although he did find someone because we found a leg floating in the pool this morning. But the most important part is that you made it out unscathed. So if you had an amazing week and enjoyed your stay here, Camp Horror Scriptorium would be thrilled if you would leave us a review, gave us a thumbs up below, and even maybe thought about subscribing, because next year's camp promises to be even darker. So until we meet again in the shadows, keep your flashlight close, your wits sharper, and remember, sometimes the real horror waits just beyond the campfire's glow. Bye bye for now.